All right? So, look at your outline. We're starting the third outline, and we're starting the third panel. Again, remember the theme, where it's low in the land, represents the kingdom of this world, okay, the kingdom of Satan, and those that follow him, do his will, the offspring, the seed of, the heirs of, the lineage of those people that are essentially doing Satan's will. Above, you see, I think, a very fascinating depiction that Jane did here. You not only see the zodiac, which of course we're going to talk about a little bit, about Nimrod and the tower and what it means, but she also puts in, interestingly enough, skyscrapers. Because it's not just an ancient issue. It's also a modern issue. You know, astrology has been from the beginning and continues to this very day and will be prominent also in the future too. We see on the right hand in the upper part now more those of the kingdom of God. We see down at the bottom, I think this depiction is of Abraham, or then called Abram. Where does he come from? Which is where?
Iraq.
Yes, near Babylon. He's told to come out, and as he moves, obviously he comes into the higher ground, into God's will, in understanding God's will, performing God's will. And of course, here we see his sacrifice of Isaac up here too. So that's the depiction of some of these events. Now, Nimrod in chapter 10 is the original prototype of Satan's worldwide evil strategy. What you see beginning in Nimrod, you will see winding its way through biblical history and winding its way through biblical prophecy, and we're going to see it coming even to the very end. It says in verse 8 of chapter 10 that Nimrod, quote, began to be, quote, Giborim. The word there is the word chalal, and it means to be defiled, polluted, changed sexually or genetically. In other words, somehow Nimrod was transformed into a Giborim. We don't know exactly how he is. It doesn't tell us the exact process by which it is, although I suspect it has to do with fallen angels personally. But at any rate, he has changed. He is no longer at some point, quote, a normal human being. Right? And the descriptions of him are not descriptions of a normal human being. It says of him that he's a hunter. And in the Hebrew, interestingly enough, it says that he's a hunter of men. Okay? I think implying both of their souls and of their bodies also. Of course, we have here the word Giborim, which describes him. And a Giborim, I'll give you a definition, is a second generation offspring of the Nephilim. This is what he's transformed into. Now it says...
He would have to allow himself to be in Satan's camp.
Absolutely.
In order for that to happen.
That's what I'm saying. He's the prototype. Everything this guy does is in the satanic playbook. Okay? He sets the stage for a pattern which continues literally to this very day. As a matter of fact, I think we're seeing the culmination of that pattern in this very day. Again, we'll talk about that more. It says that, quote, the phrase there, before the Lord.
Yeah.
It's a terrible translation from the Hebrew. And the literal translation means in direct opposition to the Lord. Okay? So people don't call out to the name of the Lord in faith, but rather they begin their opposition. They conspire together in their opposition of the Lord. The word mighty hunter in Hebrew is the word Sayid, and it means literally a warlike giant, or what we would call probably in today's terminology a super soldier, someone who is strong and violent. Now turn, if you would, to Joel, all the way to the prophet Joel, among the minor prophets in the Old Testament. Near Micah here, near Daniel, Obadiah, and all those guys. All right? And right after is Amos. So we want to turn to Joel chapter 2. I want to show you something about the Giberim. We're going to start at verse 1 of Joel 2. It says, now blow a trumpet in Zion and a sound of alarm on my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming, surely it is near. So what's the prophetic time frame he's speaking about? The day of the Lord, the return of Christ to the earth, the return of Messiah to the physical earth. He says it's a day of darkness and of gloom, of clouds and thick darkness, as the dawn is spread over the mountains. So there is a great and mighty Giberim. That's the word in Hebrew right there.
My translation says army.
It is, but it's a Giberim army. It's not a human army. And you'll see as we read, they're not humans, okay? It says there has never been anything like it. Now, if it's a human army, how could he say there's never been anything like it? There's been how many human armies through history? But he says this is a unique army. There's never been anything like this army, okay? Nor will there ever be after it. To the years of many generations, the fire consumes before them, and behind them a flame burns. The land is like the Garden of Eden before them, and desolate wilderness behind them. That's how destructive this army is, okay? And nothing at all escapes them. Their appearance is like the appearance of horses, and like war horses, so they run. With a noise of chariots, they leap on the top of mountains. Do you know of any human soldiers that can leap to the top of a mountain? Okay. He says, like the crackling of the flame of fire consuming the stubble, like a mighty people arrayed for battle. Before them, the people are in anguish. In other words, it's terrifying for people to see this. And all faces turn pale. They run like Giberim, mighty men. They climb the wall like soldiers. Now, look at this. And they each march in line, nor do they deviate from their paths. They do not crowd each other. They march everyone in his path. Now, it's a very interesting description of how an army marches. Okay? I think what we're describing there is what we would call super soldiers that are half robotic, half humanoid mixture that are of the hive mind, if you could put it that way. You know what I mean by the hive mind? That they have an internet connection, so they all perfectly coordinate in what they do. They completely are one unit in everything they do. Super soldiers.
So is this happening during the tribulation?
Yes, it is. Okay? He says they rush on the city. They run on the wall. They climb into the houses. They enter through the windows like a thief. Before them the earth quakes. The heavens tremble. And then goes the sun and the moon grow dark and the stars lose their brightness, etc. Okay? And then he ends up in verse 11, the day of the Lord is indeed great and very awesome, who can endure it. So, here is in the Hebrew an example of Giberim. And the prototype for them is Nimrod. They show up here, as we talked about last week, they show up also all through the history of Israel, all the way into the record we have of the last of the giants in 2 Samuel 21. And we see evidence of them all the way through. So, but their beginning, in a sense, their prototype is Nimrod. Now, Nimrod's name gives you a little hint about who he is. His name in Akkadian means, let us rebel. That's why he's called what he's called. It says in the chapter, in chapter 11, that he builds a tower. It says, quote, that the tower whose top will reach to heaven. This is in Hebrew the same idiom that's used in Genesis 28:12 about Jacob's ladder. Remember the story of Jacob's ladder?
Portal.
Yes, a portal. That Jacob looks at this and he says, the angels move up and down from heaven to earth on this. It's a portal, dimensional portal. It's the same phrase that's used of this top of the tower. It is a tower that is astrological in its origin, but its purpose is to create a pathway for, I believe, I think what his intent was, create more of an opening for more fallen angels to invade the earth. That's what I certainly suspect. Now, I want to talk let me also mention that the word Babylon that we see here and we see in many, many, many places in the rest of the Old Testament means literally the gate of the gods. So, what are they trying to do? Who are they focusing on? Not the God, Yahweh, but these entities that call themselves gods. In mythology, what do you have? You have a whole bunch of these, quote, demigods. All right? Different kinds of them that have different capacities and different abilities and different stories and different histories. Now, I want you to turn back from Joel to Psalm 82. Because I want to give you a little history that sometimes people don't pay enough attention to. And I want to talk about it a little bit with you. So go to Psalm 82. And we're going to look at a number of different passages. But we'll start with Psalm 82. Starting verse 1. Now, this is much less clear in the English than it is in the Hebrew. It's much more obvious in Hebrew. Start verse 1. God takes his stand in his own congregation. The Hebrew, probably the best Hebrew translation of that is divine angelic council. That's what he's talking about. The divine angelic council. He takes his stand in, quote, this congregation, this council. He judges in the midst of the rulers. The word there means angelic beings in Hebrew. So here's the picture. There's a council of angelic beings. God is the head of that council. All right? And he goes on and says, then let's drop down to verse 5. He says, they, these angelic beings in the council, do not understand, do not know, nor do they understand. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. Now, right away, you got to know this is not a human council. The human councils can't very easily shake all the foundations of the earth. And then verse 6, I said, speaking to these beings, you are gods, and all of you are the sons of the Most High. Again, in Hebrew, the B'nai Elohim, the angels. Okay? Nonetheless, you shall die like men and fall like one of the princes. Now, which kind of angels is he talking about? Yes. Okay? All right. Well, I'm going to show you a bunch more verses. Turn next from Psalm 82.
So what was this?
This is called the Divine Council. And I'm going to show you some more verses on the Divine Council.
So God gives different fallen angels?
Yes. He's talking about this council, okay? This group, this ruling group. Turn to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 32. It's interesting how we don't often understand the structure of how the heavenlies work. We don't know what the original design was. We don't know what happened to them. But let's try to understand it better. Psalms 32.
No.
I'm sorry, Deuteronomy 32. Thank you. And we're going to start, I think, in verse 7 here. Verse 7, remember the days of old, consider the years of all generations. He says, ask your father, and he will inform you, your elders, and they will tell you, when the Most High God gave the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of man, and he set the boundaries of the people according to the number of the sons of Israel. Now, this is a very interesting concept. He's talking about the nations. And how many nations do we find in the table of nations does God divide the world into? It's his number. He chooses it. 70. Okay? He chooses 70 nations. And what we're going to see is this divine council of angels are 70. And one is in charge of each nation. Originally. Okay? But we find something happens to them. And the nature of what they do changes. You might want to go back, since we're in Deuteronomy, go back to chapter 4 of Deuteronomy. He's talking about idolatry here. And talk about, that you shouldn't act corruptly about making graven images in form of any figure, likeness of male or female, in the likeness of any animal that's on the earth, the likeness of any winged bird that flies in the sky, the likeness of anything creeps in the ground, the likeness of any fish that's in the water below. Verse 19, and beware lest you lift up your eyes to heaven, okay, and see the sun and the moon and the stars, and all of the divine council. Here translated, host of heaven. The host of heaven always refers to the council of angelic beings. Okay? So he says, and do not lift up your eyes and see and look at the host of heaven and be drawn away and worship them and serve them, those which the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples under the whole earth. So again, he's referring to the fact that these original angelic beings were over the nations and were the rulers over those nations, but somehow something happened here. He's warning people to not do something. What's he warning them not to do?
Not to worship.
Not to worship them.
Don't bow down.
Don't bow down to them. So he's saying that ultimately, where does idolatry lead to, or what's the center of the idolatry? The fallen angelic beings. They're the ones that are wanting worship. Okay? They're the ones that are wanting worship. They do it through many ways. They do it through astrology. They do it through the creation of these characters, these demigod characters that we see in mythology. But we see that something happens to this divine council. Why don't you turn next to, why don't you turn next to Job? Go to Job 34. We're going to look at a couple verses there. Okay, we want to look at verse 8. I think I wrote the verse down wrong. Okay, just a second. I think I wrote the verse down wrong. I'm sorry on that one. But let's try Job 15. Go to 15. He says he's talking. It's in this dialogue with these Job's friends. Starting verse 7.
Thank you.
Okay? And he's in this dialogue, and God's speaking to this guy Eliphaz. He says, were you the first man to be born, or you brought forth before the hills? Verse 8, do you hear the secret counsel of God and limit wisdom to yourself? What do you know that we do not know? What do you understand that we do not understand? Both the gray-haired and the aged among them older than you are. And he's talking about, again, this counsel of God, this divine counsel that's being referred to. We also have, and we don't have to look at all these, but you'll see the same reference to them in Job 23:16. You'll see another reference to them in Isaiah 24:19. You'll see another reference to them in Isaiah 34 verse 1. Another reference to them in Nehemiah chapter 9 verse 5. Now, Nehemiah 9:5 is probably worth looking at. So turn over now towards the end of the Old Testament to the book of Nehemiah.
Chapter 9?
Yes. Yep. Okay. There we go, sorry. After Ezra. I'm turning pages here.
Chapter 9.
Yeah, I've got it right. I hope I wrote it down wrong. It's correct this time. He says, again, he's talking about then the Levites, these individuals. He says, arise and bless the Lord your God forever and ever.
What verse?
5, 6. Oh, may thy glorious name be blessed and exalted above all blessing and praise. Thou alone art the Lord. Thou hast made the heavens and the heaven of the heavens with all their hosts. Again, this is the divine counsel. The heavenly is there. Now, what happens, apparently, is that at a point in time, those angels that are appointed to be over the nations, Satan corrupts them. They rebel. Okay? And at that point, you now have these fallen angelic beings that are still influencing the nations. The nature of God's counsel changes, this counsel, angelic counsel, because of Satan's rebellion and him sweeping them away in his rebellion. So originally, the angelic heads of the nations were good, and now the angelic heads of the nations are evil. And of course, it's the strategies of those evil ones that cause the geopolitical situations, actually, of those nations.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is it the same angels? They just got bad, or was it like a turnover?
Well, it's angels that God appointed to this council to rule over the nations that then Satan corrupts.
The same angels.
Yes, he corrupts them. Okay. And so now they have a negative influence rather than what their original influence was supposed to be. Now, let's get back to Nimrod. Nimrod builds huge cities to honor himself and to honor humanity. And it's interesting, when you read in ancient Jewish literature about these cities, they're monstrous. They're huge. As a matter of fact, in several of the ancient records, like the Book of Jubilees, these cities have walls that are 400 feet tall. Now, we read these things, and we go, oh, that can't be. Like, for instance, in the Book of Jubilees, it makes a statement that the Tower of Babel was 5,433 cubits tall. And by the measure of the standard cubit, which is about 18 inches, it means that they're saying that the Tower of Babel was 8,150 feet tall. Okay? Now, you go, how could that possibly be? Well, I want to show you how it could be. Yes. So she's going to turn on some pictures here. That's not it. It's not the racing picture.
Go back to Amazon, we can shop.
Okay.
Why not?
There we go. Okay. Now, I'm showing you pictures of areas in Peru and Bolivia especially. These are all archaeological sites. Look at the size of these stones, obviously from this guy standing there. Look at the cut of the stones. The cut of the stones is irregular. It's not symmetrical, and yet they're all fitted in a way that you can hardly put a piece of paper in between any of them. All right? This area in Peru and also in Bolivia exists at about 12,800 feet above sea level. Okay? Not only that, but when they look at the type of stones that are up there, I'm going to show you more of them, they were quarried as far away as hundreds of miles. In other words, there's no natural stones there that are these stones. They came from somewhere else. Go to the next one. Now, I want you to look at the cut in these stones. They're huge stones, but look at the cut. The question you have to answer is, do you think people can make those cuts with chisels and hammers? And I'm going to show you more of the cuts. Look at the beveling on these. Look at the interior cuts. Look at the interior edges. All right? Go to the next one.
The previous one, remember the engineers said that even with modern technology, there is no way to make anything like this.
Not only is there no way to make it, but they know of no way to get the stones there from where the quarries were today, up to almost 13,000 feet. Go ahead. Go next. Now, actually, this is in Siberia. Okay? But I want to show you from the standpoint of pine trees in front of it. These things are hundreds of tons in weight. Hundreds. Okay? You tell me how any ancient people can cut and quarry those and then move them and stack them in this way.
Well, what's that? There are stones like that in the temple wall.
Not that size. Not that big. These are monstrous. Go ahead.
Well, those look monstrous to me.
They are big, but compared to these things are incredibly large. Okay. This is just some of the stone work they did with some of the stones. It just shows you how they fit them together. Again, there's no cement. Nothing. They're cut that exactly. Go ahead. This is another, shows you some of the cuts that are made and the remarkable precision of how they make these things.
Where is that?
That one is, I forget where it's located. I'm sorry. I don't think
Were these functional things too, or just?
Well, these are all designs of temples and structures. Now, this to me is an excellent example of the stonework. Look at the cuts up there. They're almost concentric cuts and there you have a cut, and then inside it you have a cut, and then inside it you have a cut. I don't know if I showed you this. Let's see the cut here. There's a lot of these stones that have drill holes that go from one side of the edge through to the other side of the edge, and they're perfectly round. And they're good-sized drill holes. Okay, go on to the next one. That shows you where this is located. It's the top of a 13,000-foot mountain. It begs the question, not only how they cut them, but how they get them to the top of a 13,000-foot mountain.
When you read that they could jump to the top of the mountain.
That's my conclusion as we're going. Go ahead. We have more? There we go. Okay, thank you. All right. This is a fascinating one because these guys are engineers, and what they did is they're looking at both the shape, the cuts, the size, and the structure of the stone, and what they find is that all the cuts are incredibly polished. As a matter of fact, there's one. It's in a video. I didn't download it for you, but there's one. This is Puma Punku, which is a very, very famous archaeological site with these. They took some of the stone from Puma Punku, a little piece of it, and they took it to this office where they had diamond saw, laser saw, and so what they did is they took an edge that was like this, that was cut, and they had them cut it, the same thing in a different area of the stone with diamond, and the same one with laser. And they put it under a microscope to look at it. And the cuts made by these, quote, ancient people cannot be duplicated either by diamond saw or laser cut. They were much more smooth. Much more smooth. I don't know if we have there. It's another good example of how big these things are. They're called H blocks, and they were stacked. And again, how do you cut them, and how do you stack them like that?
How do you list them?
Yeah.
How do you list them?
Yeah, that's right. How do you list them? Exactly. All right. This, I think, is fascinating because you're actually looking almost into a canyon area, and you see the intricacy of this, 100 feet tall, maybe, piece of stone that's been put in there and is cut in that way, in that area. I think it's another good archaeological example of how big those things are, and they make this very elaborate, long rectangular cut in the stone.
It looks like ancient. It looks almost like something modern.
Yes. Okay, this just shows you how big these things are. These are all engraved on the side. The point I'm making is that the fallen angels, according to the book of Enoch, gave technology to people. It's recorded through and through. Book of Jubilee says the same thing. Many, many, many ancient Jewish writings say that the fallen angels offer technology. I think this is the result of that technology, because there is no answer that I know of from any engineer about how this could be done, because they can't do it today. More or less people thousands of years doing it. I defy anyone to try to cut a stone like that with a chisel and a hammer.
And all different angles.
Yes. It's literally impossible. It cannot be done. You cannot explain it with the alleged technology that people had then. So, there's a supernatural technology that's given. And I think that's why Nimrod was able to build a tower that is 8,150 feet tall. Because he didn't have just ancient technology. He had fallen angelic technology, because he's a Gibborim. Now, let's summarize things about Nimrod. His strategy versus the intent of God. It's interesting when you look, and I was almost tempted to do it, but I didn't do it for the sake of time. When you look in chapter 11 about him, you find, starting in verse 3, a series of parallel statements about what the people inspired by Nimrod, say they're going to do, and what God himself says is responses to them. And in Hebrew, it's almost poetic. It's like God says, they say. God does, they do. Back and forth and back. And so what we see is their intention, I'm in B here of the outline, God stops the genetic attack on humanity with the flood. What is Nimrod's strategy? He's able to transform himself into a Gibrim, the very thing that God just got done killing in the flood. We see here that God decentralizes humanity into 70 nations with their own rulers. What does Nimrod do? He collects people into megacities as the dictator. This is the satanic strategy of globalism. Mm-hmm. Ask yourself what's going on in Europe today with immigration and try to give me an argument that it makes any sense whatsoever. Why are we having forced immigration in Europe?
Invasion.
Why are we having an invasion of Muslim peoples into almost all European nations? The people don't like it.
They want to control the world.
Okay? So the point is, they're centralizing. They're creating chaos, and they're trying to undo nationalism and undo patriotism so they can instill a one-world system. That's what's behind it. And that's why when you see all these things going on, economic insanity, the ethnic insanity, the immigration insanity, you have to look at it from the bigger picture. And Nimrod gives you the strategy, okay? Just like he was the first globalist, he's the pattern of globalism. They want one people that are able to speak one way, that have one leader, okay, and have that strategy. So globalism that we're seeing implementing in the world today is the strategy of Nimrod that is now coming back and obviously is being implemented in the end times in our world. We see here also that God blocks the fallen angelic invasion of the earth, and he locks away these, what Enoch said were 200 fallen angels that came down to the earth. Nimrod, of course, builds a huge astrological tower to access the spiritual dimension, that is, the gate of the gods. So we see here that everything that God does and intends is an opposite strategy of what Nimrod is trying to do in the world. That's right. God builds the constellations. He calls them the Mazzaroth. And what is it that Nimrod does? He starts astrology, the study of the planets and the stars for the purpose of predicting future through satanic power. So we have these constant contrasts of what Nimrod does, what God's strategy is. Now it gets to the point, of course, that God sees that they have this technology, they have this dictator called Nimrod, they have one language, they have huge building programs, they're trying to access, the heavenly dimension, and God then says, done. And he comes, quote, down, and he sees what Nimrod's trying to do, and he says, you're done. And he confuses the language so they cannot cooperate. Isn't it interesting what is said in chapter 11? When God sees this, he says they're one people with one intent and one language, and
they will not stop.
Right. Nothing that they put their hand to will they fail at this point. In other words, he sees that Satan has this going, and that unless he radically stops it, they're going to accomplish what they want to accomplish. So a major setback occurs in Satan's strategy. God eventually destroys the Tower of Babel. God confuses the nations, and again, they're spread out all over the place. God says, no globalism. Not allowed. Isn't it interesting that we have literally thousands of years that go by, and what is it that at the end the strategy is? gather people, and authoritarian systems, globalism, it's all back to the original. It's all headed back there. And of course, most people agree that Nimrod is the prototype of Antichrist, who is to come. So the people counsel together to conspire against God, and God counsels in the Godhead to counter their plans. And of course, he does counter their plans. So, notice that this is not over. In Revelation chapter 17 and 18, we have 2 chapters that talk about different aspects of a place called Mystery Babylon. And it's talking about the future. That he talks about its religious nature. It talks about its economic nature. It talks about its political ruling nature. And it's called Mystery Babylon because it's the reenactment of this strategy, again, to its final conclusion. Except this time it won't be headed by Nimrod. It'll be headed by Antichrist. Okay? So, we'll move on to Abraham. We're going to try to cover this outline only between chapters 8 and 37 of Genesis. So we're not going to cover all of it. We're going to select where we go. So let's go to Abraham. See on your outline. Abraham is the man who believed God. Abraham is chosen by God from this place called Ur, which is in the Shinar plain, which ironically is where Nimrod comes from. So God goes to the very place, okay, but he's going to pick the counterexample to Nimrod. That is his man, Abraham. So he goes and he calls him and he says, move. We notice, interestingly enough, some people think that, Abraham was the person that must have grown up knowing God. He didn't grow up knowing God. If you look, you don't have to turn here necessarily. I'll read it to you. But in Joshua 24, we're getting a piece of very interesting information. It says, and Joshua said to all the people, thus says the Lord God of Israel, from ancient times your fathers lived beyond this river, namely Terah, the father of Abraham, the father of Nahor, and they served other gods. So, his relatives were all idolaters. Okay, they didn't know the Lord. So God calls him. We don't know exactly how, but it must have been a fairly compelling message because he listens to it. And he and a certain amount of his family, okay, his nephew Lot and others, take off and they travel then to the west. And we see here that Abraham's family, they moved approximately 500 miles to this special piece of real estate to begin a nation. Turn, if you would, to Genesis 13.
So Abraham was very obedient right away.
He was, but at times he wasn't. But in this time he was. He's like us. Sometimes he obeyed, sometimes he didn't obey.
He wasn't supposed to take anyone else except his wife, was he?
I don't think he was prohibited necessarily from taking the others, but it did cause him problems, though.
It did.
Okay, on many levels it caused him problems. The first problem that caused him is he took his uncle Haran and his family were part of this entourage, and they end up going into originally in an area what would be today southern Lebanon to the city that they found called Haran. The problem is that's not where God told Abraham to go. And you find in the account that finally, after we think about 5 years, Haran dies, and then they go south, and they actually enter into Israel itself at that point. Now, it's in the 13th chapter, I want you to look at Genesis 13, verses 14 through 16. He says, the Lord said to Abram, after Lot is separated from, now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward, eastward and westward, for all the land which you see, and I will give it to you and to your descendants forever. And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants also can be numbered. Arise and walk about through the land, its length and its breadth, and I will give it to you. And so he did so, and walked all over what is bigger than present-day Israel, because the boundaries of it were much bigger than the current boundaries of Israel. So
he went there over to the Euphrates.
He did. Long way, much bigger area of land. That's the original definition of the area that the Jews were given. When anyone tells you the Jews must give up the land and compromise and end up for the sake of peace, you need to look at this verse, because this is the mandate of God. He says, you own this property forever. Okay? It is yours and your descendants, and no one has the right to take it from them. Okay? God picked the real estate, not Abraham. God did. Because this is where God wanted them to be. This is where God wanted Abraham to be. This is where God wanted a nation to occur, in this place. So we get back to this original understanding, which is very important. So here he picks this real estate for the accomplishment of the promise that he started in Genesis 3:15, that there would eventually be this person who would be of the seed of Adam, who would, of course, then oppose this person who would be of the seed of Satan. Abraham's response to what God says is found in Genesis 15. So if you're in 13, go over to 15. And his response is the prototype for all believers from that point on. Then he believed in the Lord, and God reckoned it to him as righteousness. 6. Genesis 15:6. It's an absolute key verse. It tells you, it's the law of first mention. Faith comes from belief. Faith comes from belief. Law of first mention. So it's a very critical verse. Now, next we see here that back in verse 14, chapter 14, verse 13, then another thing happens. So if you go back one chapter to chapter 14, in verse 13, a man comes from this actual battle that occurs and told Abraham the Hebrew. So we have here the first mention of a Hebrew, or in other colloquia, Jew. Okay? So he's first called a Hebrew. So we have the first mention of the Hebrew nation. Now, it's also interesting in 14 verses 1 through 5 that Abraham also had his own battle with the Gebarim. Here is mentioned in verse 14 the first war. First mention of it. But notice who the people are that are in the war. Verse 5. Right. Then the 14th year, Chedorlaomer, this king called Chedorlaomer, and the kings that were with him came and defeated the Raphaim and Ashtaroth-Karnaim and the Zumzuman in Ham and the Emin in this other town. So they go in and they battle these giants. All right. But interestingly enough, when you look at the names of the kings, Chedorlaomer, and let's see, first for Amphral, the king of Shinar, and Arioch, the king of Elasar, and Chedorlaomer, the king of Elan, and Tidal, the king of Goyim. When you look at what their names mean in Hebrew, they're all descriptions also of giants. They themselves are also Gebarim. So there was this miraculous war where God, through Abraham, again defeats these giant peoples at this time. So he has his own dealings with them. The point again is, Satan's always trying to invade the land. He's always trying to corrupt. He's always trying to get his strategy to be prolonged at this time. Now, God's choosing of this people and of this nation begins Satan's millennia-long strategies in all cultures to destroy the Jews. The history of the Jews is the history of Satan trying to find a way to stir up peoples and nations around them to annihilate them. It is not stopped from this day. You have the peoples in ancient Israel that Joshua fought that tried to do it. You go on through history, and I mentioned, you can go through an unbelievable number of histories here. But, you go all the way to the day of Antiochus Epiphanes, who invades, and what does he do? He starts a huge purge against the Jewish people and tries to annihilate them. You have also the days in Persia of Esther, Queen Esther. What happens? Out of nowhere, Haman decides he's got to get rid of and kill all the Jews. Why is he so insistent on doing this? But he's absolutely insistent on doing it. And he almost accomplishes it because he gets a law passed by Artaxerxes that says they can go out and kill the Jews on a certain day. And it's only to Esther's faith that she intercedes, and then the king gives them the right to defend themselves. Therefore, it doesn't happen. Okay? What is it? The great final solution of Adolf Hitler?
Holocaust.
The Holocaust. The final solution was a way to eliminate all Jews as effectively as they could do it. So we see this history against the Jews, history against the Jews, history against the Jews. And, of course, eventually, we see that final attempt against the Jews, which occurs at the Battle of Armageddon, where it's the final effort of Satan to try to annihilate the Jews at that point. God himself steps into that.
I just read that from all amount of people who were killed and tortured in concentration camps during World War II in Europe, 3/4 were Jews.
Yes. Right. And most of the Jewish population of the world was killed by Hitler, by his emissaries. Fortunately, there were a few countries, the United States being one of them, that possessed a fairly large number of Jews. And that's part of why he couldn't annihilate all of them. But it was a very incredible attempt at doing so. Now we see here also, as we look at the story of Abraham, that he and his wife Sarai, later named Sarah, are promised a child. They're promised a child for years. At one point, as I mentioned here, Abraham is approximately 85 and his wife is 75. Things are not looking too good in the child area. Okay? That's right. She's not looking like a young chick anymore here. Okay? And they find it, of course, very difficult to believe. And so Sarah decides that she's going to, quote, help God out. Yeah, I know. That's the whole point of the story. It's not just Sarah that does things like this, right? You know, we all try to help God out a lot of times. So there's a handmaid, a concubine of Abraham. This is called Hagar, and so Hagar and Abraham get together, and she becomes pregnant. And they have a son, except he's not the legal heir. He's not the intended heir. His name is Ishmael. He ends up, according to Genesis 17, verse 20, I'll read it to you. Rather ironic. It says in verse 20, and as for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I will bless him and will multiply him to be fruitful, and multiply him exceedingly, and he shall become the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. So who is Ishmael? The father of? All the Arab peoples. So here's the enmity again, the story of enmity in Genesis 3:15. God said, I'll put enmity between your seed and Satan's seed. Right? Here's another stage of the enmity. Now we have the Arab peoples coming into existence through Ishmael, who end up becoming the sworn enemy of the Jews to this very day. You have to understand, after all the politics occurs and all the UN committees that occur, there's only one fundamental reason why it is that Israel is threatened, and that is they want to exterminate Israel out of the land. All right? This starts with this verse in Genesis 17, verse 20. You can't explain it as being anything reasonable geopolitically or economically. It's because of spiritual reasons. The Jews are always going to be at enmity with the Arabs. The Arabs are always going to be at enmity with the Jews prior to the second return of Christ to this earth. So, the not correct son is born, but eventually, of course, the correct one is born. God's promise is fulfilled, and of course, Isaac is born to Abraham and to Sarah. Now, an interesting thing happens in God's way. After this long-waited-for son occurs, this beloved son, this only son occurs, God tells Abraham to do a very bizarre, seemingly bizarre thing. And we see this mentioned here in Genesis 22, if you want to turn there.
Kill him.
Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am, Lord. And he said, take now your son, your only son, whom you love. In other words, who is absolutely dear to you, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. So Abraham takes him. He's probably between 15 and 20 years old, maybe a little even older than that at this point. He takes him to this place called Moriah. Does it sound at all familiar to you?
Down the rock, still right on it.
Exactly. And the Temple Mount is also on it. He has him go to the very place where eventually God has a temple built in the future. And he makes a burnt offering. He's going to make a burnt offering sacrifice of Isaac. Except something happens. Okay, he takes the wood in verse 6, and he took his hand and the knife, and the two of them walked together. And you go on here, and you see the angel of the Lord, verse 11, called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. And he said, don't stretch out your hand against the lad, and do nothing to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your very son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind a ram was caught in the thicket by its thorns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in the place of the son. And Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. And it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord I will be provided for. So, typologically, what are we seeing here?
Drama.
Well, drama. Of course. Exactly. Isaac's sacrifice is a prototype for the future sacrifice. Exactly in the place that God wants that future sacrifice to be. Mount Moriah, in Jerusalem, where Christ was sacrificed for the sins of all people. So we see Isaac as a prototype. That the story of Isaac and the prototype of Isaac will weave its way through.
So that happened exactly in the same place?
Yes.
Where Jesus was crucified?
Well,
or a little bit away.
Yeah.
Okay.
Same city.
Mm-hmm.
Same city and probably a matter of maybe hundreds of yards away, more or less, half mile, whatever. So we see God setting all these things up. Turn, if you would, of course we see here, you don't turn to John 1, but what is in John 1:29, what is it that we hear? Jesus is called the Lamb of God. Okay? What do we see as Passover be? God institutes later as the Jews leave their captivity in Egypt, and what is Passover? They're to take a blameless lamb, sacrifice that lamb, who interestingly enough was at that point probably a household pet, okay, that lived in and around them. They're to eat all of it, it's to be consumed, okay, and they're to take the blood of that lamb, it's to be put on the outside of their doorposts for the passing over of the angel death. Their sin is covered and they're protected. Again, another image of the sacrifice of Isaac, and of course an image eventually of what Christ would do. Turn to 1 Peter 1, way back the other end of the Bible. I want to show you how this theme weaves through. 1 Peter 1, and I want you to start in verse 18. He says, knowing that you were not redeemed with perishable things like silver or gold from the futile way of the life inherited from your forefathers. Verse 19, but with precious blood of a lamb unblemished, spotless, the blood of Christ. Okay? This is the prototype that weaves its way through and only has its completion in the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. Now, Abraham in many ways is a prototype of faith. And maybe what I should do, maybe we should stop here for tonight. Because we're going to spend some time in the New Testament and we're going to talk about some of these very important ways in which Abraham's faith is shown to be completed in Christ in the New Testament. We're going to be in the book of Romans a bit. So why don't we stop here tonight? Yes, please do. What's your question?
All right. I'm assuming Abraham had free will.
Mm-hmm.
Could he have refused, or did God know that he would have faith and not resist that?
And that's a very interesting question, and it's the question of free will versus predestination in another form. Could he have refused? You'd have to say, of course, theoretically he could have. All right? He was asked to do it. He had to make efforts to do it. He had to take his son and prepare wood. Correct. Now,
in other words, God knew that he would.
But God also at the same time knew he wouldn't refuse. And even God knowing that he wouldn't refuse, if you want to spin your head more about free will and predestination, still had to do it, even though he knew that he wouldn't refuse. Put that one in your head.
Well, because Abraham didn't know that God was going to provide the go.
Not at first.
Right, even though God knew what was going to happen.
Exactly.
Abraham did.
Right.
So it was
Now,
that was awesome.
I guess to say it in another way, I would say this. If Abraham had refused somehow, okay, then I could only say that probably the events of the Bible would be slightly changed in this text, and we'd have someone else who would, because God's plan was going to continue.
Or there'd be another chance, like lots of people where he told them to do something and they didn't do it first, and then they just did that later, or it's the second thing he told them to do.
The thing about Abraham that's so fascinating is that the whole basis of his righteousness is purely because he believed God. Notice how that contrasted with the Jews in Jesus' day. What was their view of what righteousness was? It was following the law. It was doing rituals. It was works. It was, they had 1,001 rules. But they all claimed that their father was Abraham. But they didn't do the works of Abraham. That's why Jesus was so incensed at them. Because they claim we are special. We are the children of Abraham. And basically, the Lord looks at this and says, then why don't you do the works of your father Abraham?
Well, so are the Arabs.
Yeah, it's true. Isn't it interesting that even though Abraham and Sarah blow it, and they involve Hagar in this whole process, which was never meant to be, God doesn't judge Hagar. He provides. He even supernaturally provides for Hagar and Ishmael. So God's going to take the mistake,
Wasn't she more like a victim?
in a sense.
Yeah.
In a sense.
Not that she.
Yeah. So God's going to take the mistake they make, and He's not going to punish her for the mistake. But He's also going to use the mistake as a lesson to Abraham and Sarah and to the Jews. Because that's how we get the Arabs. They're going to pay dearly for the choice they made over millennia.
We're dealing with that mistake now.
Exactly.
For sure.
Still. See, again, you go back to these basic themes and you understand why things in the future happen the way they do. They're all connected to what first occurred. They're all prophetic. They all live out in their own way in the future as God's strategy is unveiled and progresses.
Well, another thing that was in chapter 14 was the first tithe.
Yes, it's true. And it's a unique thing, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
The first one.
Tithe.
Because
Abraham gave a portion after this battle. He gave it back to Melchizedek, which was God's representative.
Again, it's very interesting because this person shows up out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Called Melchizedek. Okay? And he is called the king and priest of Salem. Now, where's Salem? Jerusalem. So he's the king, he's the prince of Shalom. He's the prince of peace. That's what his name means. Okay? He all of a sudden shows up out of nowhere. Where'd he come from?
Was he Jesus?
I think he was. Okay? I think he was the pre-incarnate Christ. And Abraham somehow recognizes him and immediately gives 10% of the spoil of the war to him. And he blesses Abraham with an eternal blessing. And interestingly enough, in Hebrews, we learn about Melchizedek. And it says, the author tells us, he had no mother, he had no father. He's this person that shows up. Okay? Because it's the pre-incarnate Christ who shows up. You know?
When you get to the tithing, are you going to teach on that? Because I have.
No, I'm not going to specifically teach on it. We're trying to get all the way through to the end of the 37th chapter of Genesis.
This tithe was in the Old Testament.
Yes, it was. Yeah, it was. So it's the first mention of tithe too. That's right.